Republicans wrap up their convention as Donald Trump officially accepts the party nomination.
We are so excited for this movement for a red wave and to get Donald Trump and J.D. Vance elected to the White House this year.
While Republicans attending the convention were wholeheartedly united behind Trump, there are others not in attendance who strongly oppose his candidacy.
There's so much talk about Trump being anointed by God. That is just so far away from what we are as a nation that it's staggering to me that people believe it and people embrace it.
And continued uncertainty on the Democratic side as President Joe Biden copes with COVID and growing calls for him to drop out of the race. Today is Saturday, July 20th. Join us as we explore the issues in the news. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London in Washington.
I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States. Thank you.
The Republican National Convention ended Thursday night with a marathon speech by the now official party nominee, Donald Trump, starting with a call for unity.
I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America, because there is no victory in winning for half of America.
Trump then pivoting into his more common tone of grievance and apocalyptic warnings for the country if he is not returned to the White House.
We are indeed a nation in decline.
This as President Joe Biden faces physical and political isolation as he recovers from COVID, and questions swirl if his reelection bid can also bounce back amid intensifying calls for him to drop out of the race. And while Republicans held their convention, Vice President Kamala Harris, seen as Biden's most likely successor, spent time on the campaign trail in North Carolina Thursday, where she questioned Trump's promise of unity.
You cannot claim you stand for unity if you are pushing an agenda that deprives whole groups of Americans of basic freedoms, opportunity, and dignity.
My colleague Steve Miller spoke with William Howell, professor of politics at the University of Chicago, for an in-depth look at the Republican convention.
What are your takeaways from how this convention has differed in the past and the speed of which some of the processes have taken place, what it means for the Republican strategy going through to November?
Well, there are some striking differences between the RNC of this year and that of the past. In the distant past, of course, party conventions were moments where important decisions were made about who the nominee would be. And there was all kinds of brokering that was played out publicly and in back rooms as the various factions of a party rallied for their preferred candidate. And over the course of the convention, that was sorted out. Really, since the rise of primaries in the early 70s, these conventions tend to be coronation affairs. We know who is the nominee, and then it's about raising that person's visibility and rallying behind that person. That act and the rituals associated with it, which have been in place for, the last 30, 40 years, are taken to new heights with this convention, because even when you are in a world wherein the convention is serving as a coronation, there still is work to hold together the various factions. And, you saw that in 2016 when Trump selected Mike Pence as his vice president as a way to allay concerns about the extent to which Trump really was conservative, and to allay concerns within the evangelical community that he was the right person for the job. Nothing like that is happening right now. There's no effort to allay any latent concerns such as they exist within the Republican Party. It's all about double and tripling down on the image and the singular presence of Donald Trump himself. So J.D. Vance was selected not to broaden the base of support for Trump, but to reinvigorate the people who already stand squarely with Trump. It also is a sign, to my mind, that what's being played out here is a real sense that they're going to win in November. They don't feel the need to broaden the base or to bring others into the fold. They think that they've got a real shot at winning by simply building around the kind of populist core that Trump stands for and that Trump embodies in his remarkable hold on the Republican Party right now.
On the other side of the spectrum here in the United States, we have the Democratic Party. Joe Biden is president. He's currently running for re-election. But since that first debate, there have been growing calls for him to step aside. Where do you see it as right now the key challenges for the Democratic Party, given this, even though Biden says he's not going to step aside yet, but this internal drama as to whether or not he should run? What are the key challenges leading up as August approaches and November is just a short time away?
I think you just pointed to the number one challenge, which is the clock. It's running out. And look, a fair number of political observers and members of the Democratic Party are really concerned, not just about his electoral viability, but also dismayed that a president who promised to offer a kind of restoration and corrective to the excesses of Trump's first administration and then serve as a transition candidate to open up space and allow for the younger talent, the next generation of politicians within the Democratic Party to come to the fore and provide real leadership. And that, for whatever the wins are, and they're noteworthy of Biden's first term in office, they aren't that. And so that the primary season was not put to good use in lifting up alternatives or having a robust debate about, if not Biden, then who might it be? And nor were the 3 years that preceded it. We didn't see the president giving a long runway and a lot of airtime to, for instance, his own vice president. It was squarely about Biden all day long. And now that concerns about his ability to simply perform the job, particularly the communicative functions of the job, have been made especially acute in the aftermath of that debate. Although, note, those concerns long preceded that debate, but there it was in the debate, put in stark relief. It has really rattled the party. And it's something now that at this moment of Republican ascendance, where all the Klieg lights are on Trump and his adoring fans, we have Biden in isolation as he's trying to recover from COVID, and all the talk is about when will he step down. We spent most of this year talking about how, and I spent most of this year thinking that, look, this is a dead heat, a race. I mean, it's going to come down to the wire, and it may still yet, but in this present moment, the contrast between the two parties are as stark as they've been in quite some time.
William Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much for your time and your insights.
It was great to talk to you.
While the Republican Party appears mostly united behind former President Trump, even those who previously were against his candidacy, but there are still some in the party who strongly oppose his White House bid. Joining us now is former New Jersey Governor Todd Whitman, a former Republican who also served as administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency.
The presidential election now less than 4 months away. Republicans seem to be united behind their candidate. Former rival Nikki Haley previously called Trump unqualified. Now she's throwing her hat in the ring. J.D. Vance was a never-Trumper, likened him to Hitler, and now also his vice presidential running mate. So Democrats, on the other hand, are not united, and there's a lot of fear as a growing number of them are calling for President Biden to step down. This is all happening while he's warning a second Trump term is a serious threat to democracy. Trump is mirroring those talking points, saying Biden is a threat to democracy, and at the same time saying it's going to be a landslide and that if he doesn't win, it'll be a bloodbath. What are your thoughts, especially as a former Republican, on what's at stake here?
Well, that statement tells you all you need to know about Donald Trump. No election is fair if he doesn't win it, no matter what the voters want. And to say that it will be a bloodbath is a whistle call to his supporters to get out there and start doing some very bad things. He has said he wants to bring the country together. He picked as his vice presidential candidate someone who is one of the most divisive people on Capitol Hill. In fact, I've never heard Mitt Romney say much of bad about anybody, but he said he can't even begin to like J.D. Vance. Vance, right after the attempted assassination of the ex-president, said it was all Biden's fault. I mean, they're not trying to bring the country together. They are trying to divide. And the fact that they won't accept any election except the way they want it should terrify people.
And I think that's part of why Democrats are terrified. Do you think that their growing calls for Biden to step down is hurting their chances, or is this what they need to do in your perspective?
Well, I mean, they're right now in a circular firing squad, and that does nobody any good. Unless by this weekend, they can persuade the president to step aside. They ought to stop it and get behind it. They have a record on which to run. They ought to put that out there, tell them what the country, what more they want to do for them. You know, talking about how Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, which he absolutely is, doesn't work because most people don't have a concept of what that means or how democracy is giving them the quality of life they have. What the Democrats have to do is start talking about if you want a thriving economy, if you want safe communities, if you want thriving communities, then you have to have the rule of law. You have to respect the rule of law and the Constitution. Without those things, you can't have the rest of it. And that's where Donald Trump is a threat. He's a threat to your daily way of life.
The Republican Party, we are hearing also comments saying the election is already rigged, even before it has happened. There's a lot of concern that they won't agree to accept the results if Biden wins. How concerned are you that this election will end up decided by the Supreme Court and not the voters?
Well, I know they're not going to agree if he doesn't win, but as we saw in the last election, they brought 62 cases and all of them were thrown out because there was no there. The same thing would undoubtedly happen this time. It would probably get to the Supreme Court, but I don't think even they would, unless there is something underlying that shows that they have real reason to be concerned, which just doesn't happen. I mean, we have not had an election where there was the kind of fraud that could change the outcome, the ultimate outcome of the election. And unless they see that, I don't think even the Supreme Court is going to uphold the challenges.
Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's almost 1,000-page document with detailed plans for the next Republican administration. It certainly would dramatically change how the U.S. government works. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it would, again, it's another part of destroying the rule of law in our democracy. You cannot, well, fortunately, there are enough laws in place that you can't just overturn the civil service, although he's going to do everything he can to do that. But just stop and think. Do you really want only political operatives in all these positions making decisions about human health, making decisions about what's safe in energy? You don't. And you don't want the kind of civil service where every time there's a new election, everybody changes. The country would be whipsawed. For somebody like J.D. Vance in the 2025 program, they're talking about a national ban on abortion, which J.D. Vance believes in. It's amazing to me that he says that even for a rape, a woman should not be allowed to terminate a pregnancy. It's mind-boggling. And he doesn't think much of women, obviously, although he seems to have a very bright wife. But in the greater sense, no. And there's so much, if you listen to the convention too, there's so much talk about Trump being anointed by God. That is just so far away from what we are as a nation that it's staggering to me that people believe it and people embrace it. It's the kind of thing that we have to start to stand up against. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with the Forward Party.
Climate change. The impacts are accelerating. We're feeling it with incredible heat waves all over the place. And Mr. Trump has promised to repeal federal regulations designed to cut greenhouse gas pollution that's rapidly heating the planet. Two major recent U.S. Supreme Court rulings on presidential immunity and curbing legal authority on government agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, which you served in as the administrator. What would this mean for this climate emergency for the country and the rest of the world?
It would consign my 7 grandchildren to a life where you didn't have clean water or clean air to breathe. The country would be in a very dangerous place because climate change is an existential threat to us, where it's happening around the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have developing nations that don't have the most stable governments, when people in those countries can no longer live the lives they've had, whether they're nomadic or farming because of droughts. Where do they go? They go to the cities. There's no housing for them there. There are no jobs for them there. And that's where some of our greatest enemies, ISIS and others, go to recruit. It's something that even if you don't care about what happens in this country, where you have people who lose their lives, their jobs, their homes to floods, to tornadoes, the likes of which we haven't seen, to hurricanes. I mean, the earliest we've seen a Category 5 hurricane. These things are all related. And the problem is that for these Republicans, it's not all Republicans, but for these Republicans that support Donald Trump, they see it as a zero-sum game, that you cannot have a healthy, thriving economy and a clean and green environment. And guess what? You can't have a healthy, thriving economy if you don't have a clean and green environment. And there are all sorts of new jobs that can be created by being creative, which of which we're very good at, in coming up with new technologies, new ways to address these issues, to do away with all the Supreme Court's decision on Chevron is something that boggles my mind. To say that the judiciary would have a better idea how to set regulations than the scientists, I don't get it. I can't get there. I mean, I am a firm believer that regulations should be re-examined every 5 years, maybe 10 years, but they should be re-examined. Some of the problems go away, some of them become worse, some of them get better. We find things that we thought were bad that aren't as bad as we thought they were, so we can ease up. On the other hand, we find things that we didn't think were bad that are bad, and we need to take care of that. But since Mother Nature doesn't care about geopolitical boundaries, to say that you leave it up to the states is mindless.
And Governor, as a former Republican, tell us a little bit about your new party, Forward.
Well, Forward Party is a whole different way of approaching the process, and it really, I believe, is closer to what our founding fathers envisioned, because they warned us about parties. They warned us about parties becoming more important than policy, that people in those parties, they just want to hold on to control and power, and they wouldn't try to solve problems, and that's where we find ourselves. And so Forward is a party that at the national level does not have a platform that says you have to be pro-choice or anti-choice or pro-gun or anti-gun. It just says they're principles. You have to publicly sign a pledge that you will uphold these principles, and we will have done a good job of vetting them ahead of time to make sure that their record shows that they believe in these things. And those are uphold the rule of law, protect the Constitution, work to ensure that everyone who is legally eligible to vote can vote, ensure that there's a safe place to discuss the controversial issues, work for your constituents, and uphold a standard of honesty and integrity that we expect of our elected officials. Then it's up for the elected officials in the states to decide, well, what's important to my state? Because what's important to New Jersey or my community where I live right now is different than what it's going to be in Arizona. And candidates should be able to discuss the issues that they believe are important to their constituents and that they believe in so that they can support them when they get in office. Right now, the system works so the parties tell the candidates, these are the issues you're going to run on, and this is how you have to talk about them. And if you don't do it the way we tell you, we'll run a candidate against you in the next primary. We will withhold money from you. There are all sorts of things and ways that they punish elected representatives who don't toe the party line. So really our focus is on the state and local level, because we know whatever happens in this election, there'll be lawsuits, whichever side, there'll be lawsuits. And you want people in place as Attorney General, Secretary of State, as Governor, as County Commissioner, the people who oversee the process, to be people who will stand up for the rule of law, stand up for the Constitution. And we'll continue to do that even after the election when they're being pursued and attacked, which is what happened after 2020.
Former New Jersey Governor Todd Whitman, who also served as administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency. Governor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Lori London. If Donald Trump wins another term as president, many experts say U.S. foreign policy could change dramatically.
A growing specter of conflict hangs over Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, and all of Asia, and our planet is teetering on the edge of World War III.
Again, my colleague Steve Miller spoke with Liana Fix, fellow on Europe policy with the Council on Foreign Relations, for perspective on the U.S. role on the world stage in a second Trump term.
Do you see any deviations from either the previous Trump term or the current Biden-Harris administration in terms of how the United States would address things on the world stage based on past performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly big deviations. Perhaps the main difference on a 10,000-foot level is that the Biden administration adheres to a traditional view of the United States as hegemon in the world that provides important public goods, so that takes care of free trade routes, that provides security guarantees to certain regions in the world, Europe and in Asia, and sees its role as an ordering power. So basically to keep the world running, right? And to make sure that the world does not descend into complete chaos and disorder. And the idea is that inherently through this hegemonic ordering role, the United States benefits from a world which is more attuned to their interests. The Trump administration world is different. They don't see the United States as sort of the hegemon in the world who is responsible for bringing order into the world, and that this is inherently to the benefit of the United States. One can also call it policemen. They just don't want to be the policemen of the world anymore. How they see themselves is if anyone wants something from the United States, they can ask for it, they can pay for it, and the United States might deliver. So that's why Trump talks about NATO, for example, as alliances, as an insurance policy. So it's a much more transactional relationship where you pay for service, which is not based on sort of a general idea of the United States as the world's policeman anymore.
Yeah, to that end, I want to shift kind of focus to Asia and right now Taiwan, because this week candidate Trump said, hey, if Taiwan wants defense weapons, they need to pay us. And giving and providing defense weapons to Taiwan is mandated by U.S. law. So how do you see a Trump foreign policy with an attention and a pivot to Asia, given that also China has increased some activity in the South China Sea, which it claims, even though there are a wide number of countries that dispute that, and it even lost in the Court of Arbitration back in 2016 to the Philippines.
Yes, that's an interesting part. Everyone is talking about a China consensus in Washington, D.C., and about a tougher policy towards China by a Trump administration. But in reality, what Trump really cares about when it comes to China is about trade. So he does want to get trade benefits. He does want to impose tariffs on China. And he thinks that China unfairly gets the trade and economic benefits from its global relationship and its overcapacity. But he hasn't necessarily a sense for the geopolitical challenge that China presents, which fits with his view of alliances in general and of Europe. He doesn't see why the United States should be the hegemon, the ordering power in the Indo-Pacific necessarily. And that is a difference that he has to other members of his party who definitely do see China as a great challenger to the U.S. role in the world. So Trump will be tough when it comes to China on trade and economics, but when it comes to China geopolitically towards Taiwan, towards sort of alliances, the Philippines and South Korea and so on, Trump's advisor will have to convince him to take a stand, because that's not sort of inherently in his understanding of the U.S. world in the Indo-Pacific.
And what about a potential second Biden term in office addressing China, Taiwan, the South China Sea?
Yeah, so the Biden administration has some differences to Trump's approach towards China, and that is very much that the idea is to outcompete China. And that is why this administration is very active through very different measures, all kinds of executive powers that they have to curb Chinese influence and to curb the resources that China has to get a cutting-edge advantage when it comes to technology, when it comes to economic development and military development. It's not a containing China strategy, but they call it outcompeting. But it's still to deny China the resources they need to challenge the United States on the global stage. And that is sort of a little bit more sophisticated than what Trump would do, who's sort of much more blunt with his tariff approach. But it's also a complicated web of measures that the administration is pursuing, walking a fine line in relationship with China, sort of outcompeting China, but not escalating the relationship.
During the Trump administration, he in some circles caused a lot of ruffles, saying that NATO partners needed to pay more. And then so many did. They stepped up and met that 2% GDP contribution after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We saw the addition of 2 new members. How do you see a second Trump term, if he were to be elected, addressing NATO, addressing the war in Ukraine? He says, I can get a peace deal within 24 hours.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that he will want to do. So he wants this one picture where he's standing in between Zelensky and Putin, shaking hands with them, and ideally getting the Nobel Peace Prize for his deal. And the question will be for Europe and for Ukraine if it makes sense for them to play along and to try to get the best out of that situation, to try to sort of impose harsher terms on Russia for that, but in principle agreeing to it, or sort of to outwardly refuse any of Trump's ideas. The risk of refusing everything that Trump proposes in this regard is that he will start to blackmail Europeans. You should follow my lead, otherwise I will not give you the security umbrella that I've given you in the past. And sort of the real vulnerability that Europeans have, because they can't fill their security and defense needs fast enough to take care of their own security.
Liana Fix is a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for this week. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thank you very much for listening. For more news throughout the week, listen to International Edition Monday through Friday, or visit us anytime at voanews.com. Join us next week for more issues in the news. Until then, I'm Lori London.